In the heart of Manhattan, there was a cozy little restaurant that buzzed with life every evening. The place wasn't fancy like the five-star hotels nearby, but it had its charm: soft lighting, warm smiles from the staff, and the faint aroma of garlic bread wafting through the air. It was here that Clara worked as a waitress, balancing trays, pouring drinks, and making small talk with customers who barely noticed her. Clara was in her late 20s, with curly brown hair tied back into a messy bun most days. She wore an apron stained with coffee spills and ketchup smudges, but beneath that uniform was someone extraordinary. Clara had dreams bigger than anyone could imagine. Deep down, she wanted to be a musician, a pianist whose melodies could touch people's hearts. But for now, those dreams stayed hidden behind her tired smile and polite, "Can I get you anything else?" routine. Her real passion came alive only after work, when she returned to her tiny apartment crammed with secondhand furniture. There, tucked away in a corner, sat an old keyboard she'd bought for next to nothing at a garage sale. Every night, no matter how exhausted she felt, Clara would sit down at that keyboard and play. Sometimes it was classical pieces she'd learned years ago. Other times it was something new she composed herself. Music gave her a sense of freedom that her daily grind couldn't offer. Yet despite her talent, Clara never shared her music with anyone outside her family. Fear held her back. The fear of judgment, failure, or worse, indifference. One Friday evening, the restaurant was unusually busy. A group of well-dressed men walked in, their presence commanding attention even before they reached their table. Leading them was a tall man with sharp features and piercing eyes. His suit screamed money, and his confident stride made heads turn. This was Victor Langston, a name whispered in business circles with equal parts admiration and disdain. Known for building his empire from scratch, Victor was not just rich, he was powerful. And power, in Victor's world, meant control. As he settled into his seat, Victor scanned the room with calculated precision. He didn't miss much. When Clara approached his table to take their order, he noticed the way she moved, graceful, yet hurried, and caught a glimpse of her humming softly under her breath as she scribbled notes on her pad. Something about her intrigued him. Maybe it was the way she carried herself, or maybe it was the faint rhythm in her step. Whatever it was, Victor decided to find out more. After ordering, he leaned back in his chair and gestured toward the grand piano in the corner of the room. It was an ornate piece, polished to perfection but rarely played. Most nights, it stood silent, more decoration than instrument. "You," Victor said, pointing at Clara as she passed by with a tray of cocktails. His voice cut through the chatter like a knife. Startled, Clara stopped mid-step, nearly spilling a glass. "Me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. She glanced around, unsure if he was talking to someone else. "Yes, you," Victor replied, his tone firm. "Play something." Clara blinked, caught off guard. "Oh, I don't think—" "I wasn't asking," Victor interrupted, his gaze unwavering. There was no room for negotiation in his words. To him, this wasn't a request. It was an order. The room grew quieter as curious diners turned to watch the exchange. Some smirked, expecting Clara to stumble over her words or refuse outright. Others exchanged glances, eager to see what would happen next. Clara felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment. This wasn't part of her job description. Playing piano in front of strangers? That sounded like a nightmare. But Victor wasn't the kind of person you said no to. His reputation preceded him, and Clara knew refusing might mean losing her job or, worse, facing his wrath. Reluctantly, she set her tray down and walked over to the piano. Each step felt heavier than the last, her heart pounding in her chest. As she sat down on the bench, her hands hovered uncertainly above the keys. What should she play? Would anyone even care? Victor watched her closely, his expression unreadable. For him, this wasn't just idle curiosity, it was a test. He prided himself on spotting potential where others saw none. If Clara failed, he'd dismiss her without a second thought. But if she succeeded, well, he hadn't quite figured out what success looked like yet. All he knew was that he wanted to see what this quiet waitress was capable of. The room fell silent as Clara placed her fingers on the keys. Her first notes were hesitant, almost shy. But then, slowly, something shifted. Her breathing steadied. Her fingers began to dance across the keys, and for the first time that night, Clara forgot about the crowd watching her. Instead, she let the music take over, carrying her away to a place where fear didn't exist. Clara's fingers trembled as they hovered above the piano keys. The weight of everyone's stares pressed down on her like a heavy blanket. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, and for a moment, she considered bolting out of the room. But something stopped her, a tiny flicker of defiance deep inside. She had spent years hiding her music, keeping it locked away like a secret too precious to share. Now, here she was, sitting at a beautiful grand piano, with no choice but to play. The first notes came hesitantly, soft and uncertain like whispers in an empty room. Clara started with a simple melody, one she'd practiced countless times on her old keyboard at home. It was safe, familiar, a lifeline to cling to while she found her footing. But even those tentative notes seemed to echo louder than expected in the quiet restaurant. Conversations paused mid-sentence, forks froze halfway to mouths, and heads turned toward the piano. At first, the reactions weren't kind. A few people exchanged smirks, clearly amused by the idea of a waitress attempting to entertain them. One man muttered something under his breath that sounded suspiciously like, "This should be interesting." Another woman rolled her eyes dramatically, leaning back in her chair as if preparing for a train wreck. Clara heard none of this directly, but she felt it, the collective skepticism hanging thick in the air. Victor, however, remained unmoved. He sat perfectly still, his elbows resting on the table, his chin propped up by his hands. His sharp eyes never left Clara, studying her every move as though trying to unravel a puzzle. For him, this wasn't entertainment, it was an experiment. He thrived on challenges, on proving himself right when others doubted. And right now, he was testing Clara, not just her ability to play, but her resilience under pressure. As the seconds ticked by, Clara began to loosen up. Her initial nerves gave way to muscle memory, and her fingers moved more confidently across the keys. The melody grew richer, fuller, filling the room with warmth. She closed her eyes, letting the music guide her. In that moment, she wasn't thinking about Victor or the judgmental faces around her. She was thinking about all the late nights, spent practicing alone, the sacrifices she'd made to keep her dream alive, and the joy that music brought her when nothing else could. And then, almost instinctively, she added her voice. At first it was barely audible, blending softly with the notes. But as she gained confidence, her singing became stronger, clearer. The song she chose was one she knew intimately, Hallelujah. Its haunting beauty matched the swirl of emotions inside her, vulnerability, hope, longing. Each word carried weight, each note resonated deeply. The change in the atmosphere was palpable. The snickers faded, replaced by stunned silence. Even the most skeptical listeners leaned forward, captivated. Waiters stopped mid-stride, their trays, forgotten. Couples held hands beneath the tables, lost in the moment. Clara's voice soared, raw and unfiltered, weaving a spell that nobody wanted to break. When she reached the final verse, her eyes fluttered open, and for the first time since she'd sat down, she looked at the audience. What she saw took her breath away. People were staring at her, not with mockery or indifference, but with awe. Some had tears in their eyes. Others wore expressions of pure wonder. It was as if they'd been transported somewhere far beyond, the cozy confines of the restaurant. The last note lingered in the air, stretching out until it dissolved into silence. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then slowly, applause erupted. It started with a few scattered claps, hesitant at first, but quickly built into a thunderous ovation. Clara blinked, disoriented. Was this really happening? Had she, plain old Clara the waitress, silenced an entire room with her music? Amidst the applause, Victor stood up. Unlike the rest of the crowd, he didn't clap. Instead, he walked over to the piano, his expression unreadable. Clara tensed, unsure what to expect. Would he criticize her performance? Demand more? Or worse, dismiss her entirely? You, he said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. Clara flinched, bracing herself for whatever came next. But instead of harsh words, Victor simply stared at her for a long moment, his piercing gaze searching hers. Finally, he spoke again, his tone clipped but deliberate. You're wasted here. The room fell silent once more, the applause dying down as everyone strained to hear what he meant. Clara frowned, confused. What do you mean? She asked, cautiously. Victor didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled out a business card from his pocket and placed it on the piano beside her. Come see me tomorrow morning, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. We'll talk. With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Clara sitting there bewildered and clutching the card like it might disappear if she let go. Around her, the buzz of conversation returned, but Clara barely noticed. Her mind raced with questions. Who was this man? What did he want from her? And why, after years of being invisible, had he singled her out? Her co-workers swarmed around her, congratulating her on the incredible performance. One of the chefs even joked that she'd have to start charging extra for live entertainment. But Clara couldn't focus on any of it. All she could think about was the enigmatic billionaire who had forced her to play, and the cryptic invitation he'd extended. That night, as she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, Clara replayed the evening over and over in her mind. She thought about the fear that had gripped her when Victor first demanded she play. She remembered the way her heart had soared as the music took hold of her, and she wondered what tomorrow would bring. Whatever it was, she knew one thing for certain. Her life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The next morning, Clara woke up with a knot in her stomach. She stared at the business card on her bedside table, the sleek black font standing out against the glossy white surface. It felt surreal, like holding a ticket to a world she'd only dreamed of entering. But along with the excitement came a wave of doubt. What if this was all some cruel joke? Or worse, what if Victor expected something from her that she wasn't willing to give? She got ready slowly, choosing her clothes carefully. Nothing in her closet screamed business meeting, so she settled for a simple blouse and jeans, hoping it struck the right balance between professionalism and authenticity. As she stepped out of her apartment, the crisp morning air hit her face, but it did little to calm her racing thoughts. When she arrived at the address on the card, a towering skyscraper in the heart of Manhattan, she hesitated outside the glass doors. The lobby was bustling with people in sharp suits, their polished shoes clicking against the marble floor. Clara felt out of place, like a stray cat wandering into a palace. Still, she took a deep breath and walked in, clutching the card tightly in her hand. A receptionist greeted her with a polite smile. "Do you have an appointment?" she asked, raising an eyebrow at Clara's casual attire. Clara nodded nervously. "I'm here to see him." She didn't even know his full name, just the imposing figure who had changed her life overnight. The receptionist pressed a button on her desk phone, murmured something into the receiver, and then gestured toward the elevators. "Top floor," she said simply. "He's expecting you." As the elevator climbed higher, Clara's heart raced faster. When the doors opened, she found herself in a sprawling office suite with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. At the far end of the room sat Victor, his back to her, as he stared out at the horizon. He turned. When he heard her approach, his expression unreadable as always. "Good," he said, motioning for her to sit across from him at a sleek conference table. "You're punctual. That's a start." Clara sank into the chair, gripping its edges, to steady herself. What is this about?" she finally managed to ask, her voice trembling slightly. Victor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. "Let me be clear," he began, his tone brisk and no nonsense. "Last night wasn't a fluke. You have talent, real talent, talent that deserves more than serving coffee and taking orders. Clara blinked, unsure how to respond. No one had ever spoken to her like this before. Most people barely acknowledged her existence, let alone called her talented. But talent alone isn't enough, Victor continued, his gaze piercing. It needs direction, discipline, resources, and I can provide all of that, if you're willing to put in the work. Clara's mind reeled. Was he offering to help her pursue music professionally? It sounded too good to be true, but there was a catch. She could feel it. People like Victor didn't do anything without expecting something in return. What exactly are you saying? She asked cautiously. I'm saying I'll fund your career, Victor replied. Lessons, studio time, connections, I'll make sure you have everything you need to succeed. But in exchange, you'll follow my lead. Every decision, every move, will go through me. No exceptions. Clara's stomach churned. On one hand, this was everything she'd ever dreamed of. Someone believed in her enough to invest in her future. On the other hand, giving Victor complete control over her. Life felt terrifying. He was intimidating, unpredictable, and clearly used to getting his way. Could she trust him? I don't know. She started, her voice barely above a whisper. This is a lot to take in. Victor leaned back in his chair, studying her thoughtfully. Think about it, he said. You've spent years hiding your gift, wasting it on empty rooms and broken keyboards. Do you really want to keep living like that? His words hit home. Clara knew he was right. Her dreams had been collecting dust in the corners of her life, pushed aside by bills and responsibilities. This was her chance to change that, to step into the spotlight she'd always feared but secretly longed for. But trusting Victor wouldn't be easy. Before she could respond, he added, Take the day to decide. If you're serious about this, come back tomorrow. Otherwise, he shrugged, leaving the rest unsaid. That evening, Clara called her older sister, the only person she truly trusted. They talked for hours, Clara pouring out her fears and hopes while her sister listened patiently. He sounds intense, her sister admitted after hearing the whole story. But opportunities like this don't come around often. Just promise me one thing. Stay true to yourself. Don't let anyone take away your voice, not even him. Her sister's words stuck with Clara as she lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling. She thought about the risks, about handing over control of her life to someone as domineering as Victor. But she also thought about the possibilities. What if this was her chance to finally chase her dream, to prove to herself and to the world that she was more than just a waitress? By the time morning arrived, Clara had made up her mind. She dressed carefully, trying to project confidence even though her insides were churning. When she walked into Victor's office again, she found him waiting, his expression as unreadable as ever. I'll do it, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. But I need to know one thing. Why are you doing this? Victor studied her for a moment, his gaze softening slightly. Because I see potential in you, he said simply. Potential that reminds me of myself when I was starting out, and because sometimes people need someone to push them to greatness, even if they don't think they're ready. Clara nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. Whatever his reasons, she decided to take the leap. For better or worse, her life was about to change forever. Life under Victor's wing was nothing like Clara had imagined. At first, she thought his offer would be straightforward, lessons, studio time, and maybe a few performances here and there. But what followed was an intense, almost military-like, regimen designed to push her to her limits. Victor wasn't just funding her career, he was reshaping her entire life. And while it brought growth, it also came with challenges that tested her in ways she never expected. The very next day after their agreement, Victor handed Clara a schedule. It was color-coded, meticulously organized, and filled with tasks from sunrise to sunset. There were early morning vocal exercises, hours of piano practice, meetings with producers, and even sessions with a personal trainer. You'll need stamina for this, Victor said flatly when Clara raised an eyebrow at the fitness routine. Success isn't just about talent, it's about endurance. Clara quickly learned that Victor didn't tolerate excuses or delays. If she arrived 5 minutes late to a session, He'd lecture her about discipline. If she stumbled during a rehearsal, he'd point out every mistake without sugarcoating it. Some days, she left the studio feeling deflated, wondering if she'd made a terrible mistake. Yet despite his harshness, Victor always pushed her to try again, to dig deeper, work harder, and aim higher. One afternoon, after a particularly grueling lesson, Clara snapped. She threw her sheet music onto the piano bench and turned to face Victor. "I can't do this," she exclaimed, her voice shaking with frustration. "You keep pushing me, but I'm not some machine. I'm human." Victor stared at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, to her surprise, he softened slightly. "Yes, you're human," he said quietly. "But humans are capable of more than they think. You wouldn't believe how many times I wanted to quit when I was building my company. But I kept going because I knew giving up meant settling for less." His words hit home. Clara realized that Victor wasn't being cruel for cruelty's sake. He was challenging her because he believed she could rise above her doubts. Slowly, she began to trust his methods, even if they felt overwhelming at times. As weeks turned into months, Clara started to see changes not just in her skills but in herself. Her technique improved dramatically under the guidance of world-class instructors. Her compositions became more complex, layered with emotions she hadn't known how to express before. Even her confidence grew, bit by bit. For the first time in years, she felt like she was truly becoming the musician she'd always dreamed of being. But it wasn't all smooth sailing. The pressure took its toll. There were nights when Clara lay awake, replaying Victor's criticisms in her head. Sometimes she wondered if she'd ever measure up to his standards. Other times, she questioned whether she still recognized herself. Was she losing pieces of who she was in the pursuit of perfection? Her older sister noticed the strain during one of their weekly calls. "You sound stressed," her sister said gently. "Are you okay?" Clara hesitated before answering. "It's hard," she admitted. "Victor pushes me so hard and sometimes I feel like I'm drowning. But I'm learning so much I don't want to give up." Her sister sighed. "Just remember why you started this journey. Don't lose sight of your own goals in the middle of his plans." That conversation stayed with Clara. She decided to take more ownership of her progress. Instead of simply following Victor's instructions, she began speaking up about her ideas and preferences. To her relief, he listened, sometimes begrudgingly, but he listened nonetheless. Their dynamic shifted slightly, evolving into something resembling mutual respect. Amidst the chaos, Clara found moments of joy. She loved the thrill of creating new songs, experimenting with melodies, and watching her visions come to life. She cherished the camaraderie she developed with fellow musicians Victor introduced her to. And though it was rare, she even caught glimpses of another side of Victor, a man who cared deeply about excellence and saw potential where others didn't. Then came the announcement. Victor had arranged for Clara to perform at a prestigious gala. It was a high-profile event attended by industry elites, critics, and celebrities. Success or failure hinged on this single night. For Clara, it felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, ready to leap into the unknown. Preparations for the gala consumed her life. Every detail mattered: the song selection, the stage setup, even her outfit. Victor oversaw everything, ensuring nothing was left to chance. "This is your moment," he told her one evening as they reviewed the final arrangements. "Don't waste it." Despite the mounting pressure, Clara couldn't help but feel a spark of excitement. This was her chance to prove herself, to show the world that she belonged on that stage. As the date approached, she poured every ounce of energy into perfecting her performance. Late nights became even later, and early mornings started earlier. But through it all, she held on to the belief that she was doing something extraordinary. On the eve of the gala, Clara stood in front of the mirror in her tiny apartment, staring at her reflection. Gone was the shy waitress who once doubted her abilities. In her place stood a confident woman, dressed in an elegant gown, her eyes shining with determination. She thought back to the restaurant, the grand piano, and the man who had forced her to play. Whatever happened tomorrow, she knew one thing for certain. She was no longer afraid to let her music speak for her. With that thought, Clara closed her eyes and whispered a silent promise to herself. No matter what, she would stay true to her art and to the person she'd worked so hard to become. The night of the gala arrived, and Clara woke up with a strange mix of excitement and dread swirling in her stomach. She had spent months preparing for this moment, perfecting her songs, rehearsing until her fingers ached, and visualizing every detail of the performance. Yet no amount of preparation could fully calm the nerves that came with stepping onto such a big stage. This wasn't just any concert. It was her debut in front of some of the most influential people in the music industry. One wrong note, one shaky breath, and everything she'd worked for could crumble. She got ready slowly, choosing each piece of her outfit with care. Victor had insisted on hiring a stylist, but Clara had put her foot down about one thing. She wanted to feel like herself. The gown she picked was simple yet elegant, a deep navy blue that shimmered faintly under the light. It hugged her figure without being too flashy, and when she looked in the mirror, she felt a flicker of confidence. Her hair was pulled back into a loose bun, letting a few strands frame her face. Minimal makeup completed the look, giving her an understated grace that matched her personality. As she stood there, staring at her reflection, Clara's mind wandered back to the journey that had brought her here. From serving tables at a quiet restaurant to standing on the brink of something monumental, it almost felt surreal. She thought about all the late nights spent practicing, the sacrifices she'd made, and the relentless push from Victor. For, better or worse, he had been the driving force behind her transformation. Without him, she might still be hiding her talent, content to play only for empty rooms. Her phone buzzed on the dresser, pulling her out of her thoughts. It was a text from Victor. "Be downstairs in 10 minutes. Don't keep me waiting." His words were curt as always, but Clara couldn't help smiling. Even though he rarely showed it, she knew he cared deeply about her success. He wouldn't have invested so much time and energy otherwise. When she stepped outside, a sleek black car was waiting for her. Victor sat in the back seat, scrolling through his phone. As she slid in beside him, he glanced up briefly. "You look fine," he said, his tone neutral. Clara raised an eyebrow. Coming from him, that was practically a compliment. The ride to the venue was quiet, save for the hum of the engine and the occasional tap of Victor's fingers against his phone screen. Clara tried to focus on the scenery passing by, the glittering lights of Manhattan, the steady flow of traffic, but her thoughts kept drifting to what lay ahead. What if she froze on stage? What if the audience didn't connect with her music? The questions swirled endlessly, threatening to overwhelm her. Finally, they arrived at the grand hall where the gala was being held. The building was breathtaking, its marble facade glowing softly under the evening lights. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Guests mingled in opulent ballrooms adorned with chandeliers and fresh flowers. Waiters circulated with trays of champagne, while soft classical music played in the background. Clara felt completely out of place among the polished crowd, but Victor guided her through the chaos with his usual efficiency. "You'll go on in 30 minutes, he told her as they reached the green room backstage. "Remember what we talked about. Breathe, focus, and trust yourself." Clara nodded, though her hands were trembling slightly. She watched as Victor disappeared into the crowd, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Backstage was eerily quiet, compared to the buzz outside. She paced nervously, trying to shake off the tension. A young technician approached her holding a microphone headset. "Ready for sound check?" he asked cheerfully. Clara forced a smile and followed him to the stage. Stepping out into the vast auditorium, she felt dwarfed by the size of it. Rows upon rows of seats stretched out before her, each one soon to be filled with expectant faces. The stage itself was massive, dominated by a gleaming grand piano positioned center stage. Clara ran her fingers over the keys during the sound check, drawing comfort from their familiar coolness. When the time finally came, Clara took a deep breath and walked onto the stage. The spotlight hit her like a wave, blinding her momentarily. For a split second, panic threatened to take over. But then she remembered Victor's advice. Breathe, focus. She closed her eyes, inhaling deeply, and let the noise of the world fade away. The audience fell silent as Clara sat down at the piano. She began with a soft, gentle melody, an original composition inspired by her journey. The notes flowed effortlessly, weaving a story of struggle, hope, and resilience. Her voice joined the music, clear and unwavering, carrying the weight of every emotion she'd ever felt. As she sang, she poured her heart into the performance, leaving nothing hidden. Halfway through the set, Clara paused briefly to address the audience. "This next song is dedicated to anyone who has ever doubted themselves," she said, her voice steady despite the nerves bubbling beneath the surface. "It's about finding your own strength, even when it feels like the odds are stacked against you." The crowd listened intently, captivated by both her music and her words. By the time she reached the final note, the entire room erupted into applause. People rose to their feet, cheering and clapping as if they couldn't get enough. Clara blinked, back tears, overwhelmed by the response. For the first time in her life, she truly felt seen. Backstage, Victor waited for her, his expression unreadable as usual, but as Clara approached, he gave her a rare nod of approval. "Not bad," said simply, though the pride in his eyes betrayed his casual tone. That night marked the beginning of Clara's rise in the music world. Offers poured in from record labels, producers, and collaborators eager to work with her. Critics praised her raw talent and emotional depth, calling her performance unforgettable. And while the road ahead would undoubtedly have its challenges, Clara knew one thing for certain: she had found her voice and she wasn't afraid to use it. The aftermath of the gala was a whirlwind. Clara's phone buzzed nonstop with messages, calls, and emails. Record labels wanted to sign her. Producers offered collaborations. Music critics raved about her performance, calling it a revelation and the voice of a generation. It was surreal, like stepping into a dream she'd once thought impossible. But amidst the chaos, one thing remained constant. Victor. He didn't gloat or pat himself on the back for his role in her success. Instead, he stayed in the background, quietly guiding her through the flood of opportunities. When Clara was overwhelmed by the sheer volume of offers, Victor stepped in. "You don't need to say yes to everything," he told her one evening, as they sat in his office surrounded by stacks of contracts and proposals. "Pick what aligns with your vision, not just what looks flashy." Clara appreciated his advice, though she couldn't help but notice how different he seemed now compared to when they first met. Back then, he had been all sharp edges and cold commands, a man who demanded perfection without apology. But over time, Clara had glimpsed another side of him. He wasn't exactly warm, but there were moments when his humanity shone through. Like the night after the gala, when he handed her a glass of sparkling water and said almost gruffly, "You did good out there." As weeks turned into months, Clara began navigating her new life with growing confidence. She signed with a record label that gave her creative freedom, something Victor had insisted on. "Your music is yours," he'd said firmly during negotiations. "Don't let anyone take that away from you." With his guidance, she recorded her debut album, pouring her heart into every track. The process was exhausting, but exhilarating, and she found herself relishing the challenge. Her relationship with Victor evolved too. At first, their dynamic had been strictly professional, him barking orders, her following them without question. But as they worked together, cracks began to form in his tough exterior. One day, while reviewing edits for her first single, Victor surprised her by sharing a story from his own past. "I started my company with nothing," he admitted, leaning back in his chair. "No connections, no safety net, just determination and a stubborn refusal to fail." Clara listened, fascinated. She'd always assumed Victor's wealth and power came easily, but hearing him talk about his struggles made her see him in a new light. For all his flaws, he understood hardship, and he believed in fighting for what mattered. That realization softened some of the resentment she'd carried toward his harsh methods early on. Still, working with Victor wasn't without its challenges. His perfectionism could be maddening, and his blunt critiques often left Clara questioning her abilities. But she also learned to push back when necessary. During one particularly heated argument about the cover art for her album, Clara stood her ground. "This isn't just about sales," she argued. "It's about telling my story. If I lose that, then what's the point?" To her surprise, Victor nodded slowly. "Fair enough," he conceded. "Let's find a compromise." It was a small victory, but it marked a turning point in their partnership. Clara realized that while Victor might lead with authority, he respected those who stood up for themselves. When the album finally released, it soared to the top of the charts. Critics praised its authenticity, calling it a masterpiece of vulnerability and strength. Fans connected deeply with Clara's lyrics, which spoke of resilience, self-discovery, and hope. Overnight, she went from being an unknown waitress to a household name. The highlight of this new chapter came when Clara performed at a major awards show. Standing on stage in front of thousands of people, she felt a surge of gratitude, not just for her success, but for the journey that had brought her here. As the spotlight bathed her in warmth, she spotted Victor sitting in the audience, his expression unreadable as always. But for a brief moment their eyes met, and Clara saw something she hadn't noticed before: pride. After the ceremony, Victor approached her backstage. For once, he wasn't carrying a clipboard or barking instructions. Instead, he simply stood there, hands in his pockets, looking almost awkward. "Well," he said, clearing his throat, "looks like you won't need me anymore." Clara laughed softly. "I'll always need you," she replied honestly. "You believed in me when no one else did, including myself." Victor shrugged, trying to brush off the sentimentality. "I just gave you a push," he muttered. "The rest was all you." But Clara knew better. Without Victor's relentless drive and unwavering belief in her potential, she might never have found the courage to step into the spotlight. He had been more than a mentor. He had been a catalyst for change. Their partnership eventually came to an end, not because of conflict, but because Clara was ready to stand on her own. Victor stepped back gracefully, leaving her to chart her own course. They stayed in touch, occasionally exchanging texts or meeting for coffee when their schedules aligned. Their conversations were lighter now, less about business and more about life. Looking back, Clara often reflected on how far she'd come. From serving tables to performing on global stages, her journey had been anything but ordinary. And while she owed much of her success to Victor, she also recognized the role she had played in shaping her destiny. She had faced fear head-on, embraced vulnerability, and trusted her instincts even when it felt terrifying. Years later, when Clara was asked in interviews about her rise to fame, she always mentioned the billionaire who had forced her to play piano that fateful night. "He changed my life," she would say with a smile. "But the real magic happened when I stopped doubting myself and let my music do the talking." And so, Clara continued to write, perform, and inspire others with her story. Her music became a beacon of hope for anyone chasing a dream against all odds. Through it all, she carried the lessons she'd learned, not just from Victor, but from her own resilience. Because sometimes the most powerful transformations begin with a single note, played with trembling hands, until the world falls silent and listens.